Welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 16, World War II, Section 4, The Allied Victory. This was originally given on May 19th, 2015, which actually is today, so shockingly I'm not recording this on a separate day. Main idea for today's notes: empire building. Led by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the Allies score key victories and win the war. The Allies' victory in World War II set up conditions for both the Cold War and today's post-war world. So the world that you live in today, somewhat a result of World War II. A war on two fronts. On December 22, 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt met at the White House to develop a joint war policy. Stalin had asked his allies to relieve German pressure on his armies in the east. He wanted them to open a second front in the west, and this would split the German strength by forcing them to fight major battles in two regions instead of one. Churchill agreed with Stalin's strategy, and the Allies would weaken Germany on two fronts before dealing a death blow. At first, Roosevelt was torn, but ultimately agreed. The tide turns on two fronts. Churchill wanted Britain and the United States to strike first at North Africa and then southern Europe, specifically in Italy. The strategy angered Stalin, of course, and he wanted the Allies to open the second front in France. The Soviet Union, therefore, had to hold out on its own against the Germans. All Britain and the United States could offer in the way of help was supplies. Nevertheless, late in 1942, the Allies began to turn the tide of the war both in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front, and in Japan. The North Africa Campaign. As you recall from Section 1, General Erwin Rommel took the key Libyan port city of Tobruk in June 1942. With Tobruk's fall, London sent General Bernard Montgomery, Monty, to his troops to take control of British forces in North Africa. By the time Montgomery arrived, however, the Germans had advanced into an Egyptian village called El Alamein, west of Alexandria. They were dug in so well that British forces could not go around them, and the only way to dislodge them, Montgomery decided, was with a massive frontal attack. The Battle of El Alamein began on the night of October 23rd. The roar of about 1,000 German guns took the Axis soldiers totally by surprise. They fought back fiercely and held their ground for several days, but by November 4th, however, Rommel's army had been beaten. He and his forces fell back. As Rommel retreated west, the Allies launched Operation Torch. On November 8th, an Allied force of more than 100,000 troops, mostly Americans, landed in Morocco and Algeria. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower led this force. Caught between Montgomery's and Eisenhower's armies, Rommel's Afrika Korps was finally crushed in May of 1943. Dwight D. Eisenhower is one of your vocab terms. You need to make sure you get that. And he is the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, and later the 34th President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. The Battle of Stalingrad. So we're going to go from northern Africa over to Russia now. German troops not only met their match in northern Africa, but as Rommel suffered defeats there, German armies also met their match in the Soviet Union. The German advance had stalled at Leningrad and Moscow in late 1941, and the bitter winter made the situation worse. When the summer of 1942 arrived, however, Hitler sent his Sixth Army under the command of General Friedrich Paulus to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. The army was also to capture Stalingrad, which is now called Volgograd, a major industrial center on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. And the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, went on nightly bombing raids that set much of the city ablaze and reduced the rest to rubble. By the way, the Battle of Stalingrad is a seven-month-long battle between 1942 and 43. This is your vocab term up here. The Battle of World War II, in which German forces were defeated in their attempt to capture the city of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. That also kind of, gives you a spoiler for the next slide, but anyway. Again, the Luftwaffe is going on nightly bombing raids of the city. They are relentlessly bombing Stalingrad. Despite this, the situation the situation looks desperate. Nonetheless, Stalin had already told his commanders to defend the city named after him to the death. By early November 1942, however, Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city. Then another Russian winter set in. On November 19th, Soviet troops outside the city launched a counterattack. Closing in around Stalingrad, they trapped the Germans inside and cut off their supplies. General Paulus, who started the attack, begged Hitler to order a retreat. But Hitler refused, saying that the city was, quote, to be held at all costs. On February 2, 1943, some 90,000 frostbitten, half-starved German troops surrendered to the Soviets. These pitiful survivors were all that remained of an army of 330,000. Stalingrad's defense, however, had cost the Soviets over 1 million soldiers, and the city was 99% destroyed. However, the Germans were now on the defensive, with the Soviets pushing them steadily westward. Invasion of Italy. As the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin continued to urge the British and Americans to invade France. However, what really happened is Roosevelt and Churchill decided to attack Italy first. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily and captured it from the Italian and German troops about a month later. The conquest of Sicily toppled Mussolini from power, and on July 25th, King Victor Emmanuel III had the dictator arrested. On September 3rd, Italy surrendered. But the Germans seized control of northern Italy and put Mussolini back in charge, and finally the Germans retreated northward, and the victorious Allies entered Rome on June 4, 1944. Fighting in Italy, however, continued until Germany fell in May of 1945, and on April 27, 1945, Italian resistance fighters ambushed some German trucks near the northern Italian city of Milan. Inside one of the trucks, they found Mussolini disguised as a German soldier. They shot him the next day and later hung his body upside down in downtown Milan for all to see. So that is the end of Italy and Mussolini. The Allied home front. Let's go back home for a second. Wherever the Allies fought, people in the home fronts rallied to support them. In war-torn countries like the Soviet Union and Great Britain, civilians, of course, endured extreme hardships. Many lost their lives. Except for a few of its territories, such as Hawaii, the United States did not suffer invasion or bombing. Nonetheless, Americans at home made a crucial contribution to the Allied war effort. Americans produced the weapons and equipment that would help win the war. Mobilizing for war. Defeating the Axis power required mobilizing for a total war. The United States factories converted their peacetime operations to wartime production and made everything from machine guns to boots. Automobile factories produced tanks instead of cars. A typewriter company made armor-piercing shells. By 1944, between 17 and 18 million U.S. workers, many of them women, had jobs in war industries. With factories turning out products for the war, a shortage of consumer goods hit the United States. From meat and sugar to tires and gasoline, from nylon stockings to laundry soap, the American government rationed scarce items. Setting the speed limit at 35 miles per hour also helped to save gasoline and rubber. In European countries directly affected by the war, rationing was even more drastic. To inspire their people to greater efforts, Allied governments conducted highly effective propaganda campaigns. One good example, in the Soviet Union, a Moscow youngster collected enough scrap metal to produce 14,000 artillery shells, which is a tremendous amount of metal. And a Russian family used its life savings to buy a tank for the Red Army. In the United States, many youngsters and adults, too, saved their pennies and bought government war stamps and bonds to help finance the war. Now, government propaganda also had kind of a negative effect. After Pearl Harbor, a wave of prejudice arose in the United States against Japanese Americans. Most lived in Hawaii or on the West Coast. The bombing of Pearl Harbor frightened Americans, and this fear, encouraged by government propaganda, was turned against the Japanese Americans. They were suddenly seen as the enemy. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt issued an executive order calling for the internment of Japanese Americans because they were considered a threat to the country's security. In March, the military began rounding up these aliens and shipping them to relocation camps. The camps were restricted military areas located far away from the coast. Such locations, it was thought, would prevent these enemy aliens from assisting the Japanese invasion if it came. However, The odd thing about this is two-thirds of those interned were Nisei, or what are basically second-generation native-born American citizens whose parents were Japanese. Most of them, not most of, but many of them volunteered for military service and fought bravely for the United States, even though their families remained in the camps. Victory in Europe, D-Day, Part 1. While the Allies were dealing with the issues on the home front, they also were preparing to push toward victory in Europe. In 1943, the Allies began secretly building an invasion force in Great Britain. Their plan was to launch an attack on German-held France across the English Channel. By May 1944, the invasion force was ready. Thousands of planes, ships, tanks, and landing craft, and more than 3 million troops awaited the order to attack. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the commander of this enormous force, planned to strike on the coast of Normandy in northwestern France. The Germans knew that an attack was coming, but they did not really know where it would be launched. To keep Hitler guessing, the Allies set up a huge dummy army, basically balloons, and make-believe other equipment was set up on the coast near an area called Calais, another French seaport. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy was the greatest land and sea attack in history. The invasion began on June 6, 1944, and this is now known as D-Day. At dawn of that day, British, American, French, and Canadian troops fought their way onto a 60-mile stretch of beach in Normandy. The Germans had dug in with machine guns, rocket launchers, and cannons, and they sheltered behind concrete walls 3 feet thick. Not surprisingly, the Allies took heavy casualties, especially on the beaches. Among the American forces alone, more than 2,700 men died on the beaches the first day. Despite heavy losses, however, the Allies held the beachheads. Within a month of D-Day, more than 1 million additional troops had landed. Then, on July 25th, the Allies punched a hole in the German defenses near Saint-Lô, and the United States Third Army, led by General George Patton, broke out. A month later, the Allies marched triumphantly into Paris, France, and by September they had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg from Nazi Germany. They now set their sights on Germany itself. D-Day is one of your vocab terms. It is June 6, 1944, the day on which the Allies began their invasion of the European mainland during World War II. Now let us go see the Battle of the Bulge. As the Allied forces moved towards Germany from the west, the Soviet army was advancing towards Germany from the east. They were kind of between two hard places. Hitler now faced a war on two fronts. In a desperate gamble, he decided to counterattack in the west. Hitler hoped a victory there would split the American and British forces and break up Allied supply lines. Explaining the reason behind this plan, Hitler said that, quote, "The battle is to decide whether we shall live or die. All resistance must be broken in a wave of terror." Close quote. On December 16th, German tanks broke through weak American defenses along a 75-mile front in the Ardennes. The push into Allied lines gave the campaign the name, you can kind of see it here as a U-shape, the Battle of the Bulge. Although caught off guard, Allies eventually pushed the Germans back, and the Germans had little choice but to retreat, since there were no reinforcements available to help them. The Battle of the Bulge is also one of your vocab terms. It is the 1944-45 battle, basically December and January of those 2 years, in which the Allied forces turned back the last major German offensive of World War II. Germany's unconditional surrender. After the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe rapidly drew to a close. In late March 1945, the Allies rolled across the Rhine River into Germany. By the middle of April, a noose was closing around Berlin. About 3 million Allied soldiers approached Berlin from the southwest, and another 6 million Soviet troops approached from the east. By April 25, 1945, the Soviets had surrounded the capital and were pounding the city with artillery fire. The Soviet shells burst over Berlin. Hitler prepared for his end in an underground headquarters beneath the crumbling city. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, and the next day, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. They took both cyanide and shot themselves. Their bodies were then carried outside and burned by their underlings. On May 7, 1945, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich from the German military. President Roosevelt, however, did not live to witness the long-awaited victory. He had died suddenly on April 12th as Allied armies were advancing towards Berlin. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, then received news of the Nazi surrender. On May 9th, the surrender was officially signed in Berlin, and the United States and other Allied powers celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. After nearly 6 years of fighting, the war in Europe had ended. However, although the war in Europe was over, the Allies were still fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. With the Allied victory at Guadalcanal, however, the Japanese advances in the Pacific had been stopped as of 1942. For the rest of the war, the Japanese retreated before the counterattack of the Allied powers. By the fall of 1944, the Allies were moving in on Japan. In October, Allied forces landed on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been ordered to leave the islands before their surrender in May 1942, waded back ashore in Leyte with his troop. On reaching the beach, he declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The takeover would not be quite that easy. The Japanese had devised a bold plan to halt the Allied advance, and they would destroy the American fleet, thus preventing the Americans from resupplying their ground troops. This plan, however, required risking almost the entire Japanese fleet to do so. They took this gamble on October 1923 in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Within 4 days, the Japanese Navy had lost disastrously, and eliminating it as a fighting force in the war. Now only the Japanese army and the feared kamikazes stood between the Allies and Japan. The kamikazes, by the way, were Japanese suicide pilots. They would sink American ships by crashing their bomb-filled planes into them. In March 1945, a month after the bitter fighting and heavy losses, American Marines took Iwo Jima, an island of 760 miles from Tokyo. On April 1st, U.S. troops moved on to the island of Okinawa, which is only about 350 miles from the southern tip of Japan. The Japanese put up a desperate fight. Nevertheless, on June 21st, one of the bloodiest land battles of the war ended, and the Japanese lost over 100,000 troops, the Americans only 12,000. The Japanese surrender is up next. Kamikaze, by the way, is one of your vocab terms. It is during World War II the Japanese suicide pilots trained to sink Allied ships by crashing bomb-filled planes into them. The Japanese surrender. Here we go. After Okinawa, the next stop for the Allies had to be Japan. President Truman's advisors had informed him that an invasion of the Japanese homeland might cost the Allies 500,000 lives, and the Japanese probably even more than that. Truman had to make a decision whether to use a powerful new weapon called the atomic bomb or A-bomb. Most of his advisors felt that using it would bring the war to the quickest possible end and actually save several 100,000 lives. The bomb had been developed by the top-secret Manhattan Project headed by General Leslie Groves and the chief scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Truman just learned of the new bomb's existence when he became president. The first atomic bomb was then decided to be used and was exploded in a desert in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. President Truman then warned the Japanese. He told them that unless they surrendered, they could expect a rain of ruin from the air. The Japanese did not reply, so on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a Japanese city of nearly 350,000 people. Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people died in the attack instantly. 3 days later, on August 9th, because the Japanese did not decide to surrender, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a city of another 270,000 people. More than 70,000 people were also killed there immediately. Radiation fallout from the two explosions killed many more in the years to come after this, and people are still dealing with problems from this today. The Japanese finally surrendered to Douglas MacArthur on September 2nd. The ceremony took place aboard the United States battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. With Japan's surrender, the war had ended. Now countries faced the task of rebuilding after the war. With a great deal of the world in Europe and in Asia in ruins, countries now had a big problem on their hands about how to go about fixing the world. Thanks for listening. I will see you in section 5, our last section of the year, and then we will have exam review. So there you go. Have a good one. Bye.